Hello, my name's Professor Colin Mayer. I'm the Peter Moores Professor of Management Studies at the Side Business School in Oxford, and I'm the former Dean of the Side Business School. I have with me today Professor Thomas Noe, who's the Ernst Button Professor of Management Studies here at the Side Business School and is a Professorial Fellow at Balliol College in Oxford. Professor Noe is a great expert on corporate governance, and I want to start by asking you, Tom, about the way in which corporate governance has contributed to the financial crisis that we've been encountering over the last few years. Many people believe that poor corporate governance has contributed to that. Now, can you tell us, what do people mean by corporate governance, and how might it have contributed to the failures of the financial system?
Well, I think that typically what is meant by corporate governance is a system by which stockholders control managers, and the mechanism typically used is a board, which acts as an intermediary between shareholders and managers. There are some nuances in the definition, because some would define corporate governance as good corporate governance as governance that acts for the benefit of all owners, not simply stockholders. In general, there's also some other ambiguity in the term, if you will, because sometimes what we mean by good corporate governance is having a good outcome for society, and occasionally those definitions contradict each other. For instance, when we think of the financial crisis, there are very good reasons why shareholders in banks and financial institutions, because of implicit government guarantees, would actually like to take risks ex ante. And therefore, if good corporate governance simply means working in the interest of those shareholders, then managers following risky policies is actually consistent with a good governance system. That is, that the boards in fact motivating managers to take on risk would be consistent with good governance under the first definition, but certainly not under the definition of choosing policies that are socially optimal.
And isn't it simply the case that bankers were paid too much, and that's the heart of the problem? What we really need to do is to control bankers' pay, or is it more complex?
Well, I assume that certainly if you pay bankers or pay anyone too much, if you pay them vastly more than their labor market value, then there's some distortion caused. The price of bankers is too high, and we don't have enough bankers hired. But I think the essential problem that was being the essential social issue, or by far the bigger issue, is the policies pursued by these bankers, and that's going to depend on not so much how high their pay is in absolute terms, but on whether that pay gives them incentives to take risk or not take risk. So we could have a very high pay package, which would induce conservatism, as long as suppose it's tied to, say, a long-term pension that is only going to be paid if the bank survives, and it's it's outrageously large. Well, then our banker would be overpaid, but would be quite cautious and conservative, and would not be operating at the limits of the capital structure constraints. On the other hand, we could have our banker who gets a much more lean compensation policy, but one which is entirely based on out-of-the-money options, which will only be exercised if the bank's value goes up 50%, whom would be quite a risk taker, but probably wouldn't be able to afford as many mansions as our first banker.
But I think what really upsets people is the observation that as banks perform poorly, the pay of executives continue to go up. Isn't that troublesome?
Well, most of my research has been looking at a more general question of executive pay overall, and a lot of that is research which predates the banking crisis. But what we find in general is there's a huge amount of the increase in executive pay can be explained or normalized away, if you will, if we simply take the executive pay and divide it by the market value of the firms which the executives manage. And once we do that, we find a much more stable relationship. And in fact, we find that the executive pay scaled for market value was actually higher in 1947 and 1948 than it is today, at least in the U.S. Although again, this is another peak period, if you will. So it's very close to the 48-49 level. So it's difficult it's definitely true that executive pay in dollar terms has gone up, but there are good theoretical reasons for that, which are completely unrelated to the story of suborn boards and corrupt management. One explanation that's been offered recently in the literature, which is received a great deal of play in the academic literature, but not so much in the business press, is the idea of something called positive assortive matching. And the idea there is that if you're managing a $100 billion company with a $100 billion turnover, sort of like BP, if you could make even the slightest improvement in that company's value, or if you can do just a little bit better than your rival candidate, then it makes sense for BP to pay you a huge premium over the rival, because in essence you're applying your skills to a huge asset base. Now, from an ethical point of view, this seems unfair because not everyone can apply their skills to BPs, if you will, and your rival, who's almost as good as you, may go to a firm with a $50 billion asset base and be paid vastly less than you, even though your skill sets are almost identical. You're just a little bit better. But that's economically rational from the point of view of BP. So what we tend to get is a skew in executive pay where the median executive pay is much lower than the mean pay, and a lot of the reason that average pay is so high, a lot of it is influenced by a few of these outliers who are essentially very large firms who are paying a lot, perhaps to get a product which is only slightly better than the alternative CEO, or which even they themselves believe is only slightly better, but in their case it's a perfectly rational choice.
But doesn't that really illustrate the concern that people have? And that is, it may be extremely desirable from BP's point of view to capture a slightly better CEO and pay them a lot to get them. But from society's point of view, whether or not BP is slightly better than Shell is largely irrelevant.
Well, I guess that it's from a society's point of view, the matching is also optimal too, because the slight percentage difference in BP's value caused by our slightly better CEO generates a huge dollar difference in value. So even though our CEO only makes if he could make a 1% increase in the turnover, well, that would be $1 billion, which is far more than our CEO is being paid. So if this is really the story of what's going on, it's socially optimal too. And of course, with the caveat that we're not concerned about the distribution of income, we're sort of just trying to organize society in a way to maximize the greatest total amount of output. I think another reason for high CEO pay is the sort of superstar effect. I think that as more and more disclosure has been forced on firms, or firms have decided to disclose more, the choice of CEO is in some ways a signaling mechanism. So if you think you're a very good driver, you're not going to go driving around with a Golf. You're going to drive a Maserati. So in some sense, firms may have an incentive to hire star CEOs in order to signal their own quality. And ironically, efforts to force more and more disclosure may actually exacerbate that problem. We find that CEOs are paid the most in countries like the US and the UK, which require the most disclosure. and much less in countries where compensation is much more confidential, like Germany. So many of the ills that we find or the perceived ills in the CEO labor market can be traced back to previous government interventions or social interventions which were attempting to which were attempting to correct problems. We find the first use of options for CEOs, the earliest use was actually encouraged in the US by the government as a way of making CEOs more entrepreneurial.
Do you think in general that we need more regulation in this area, or do you think that regulation can actually be damaging?
I think there is little history that the regulation thus far has generated any value either for shareholders or for society. The best way to increase the efficiency of the CEO labor market, if you want to get rid of, say, CEO entrenchment, which is a concern for many, the idea that CEOs essentially can't be removed by shareholders, is to increase shareholder power, and in which case shareholders themselves or financial intermediaries have a huge incentive to eliminate entrenched and incompetent CEOs. There's a huge amount of value to be created there. So I think if you simply pull the obstacles out of their way, they will do that. Again, there's a slight caveat would be we do have a bit different issue with banks, because in essence the taxpayer is sort of the owner of some of these banks, in which case as an owner they have a certain clear right to limit compensation just as any other firm owner would do. But as long as you're talking about firms that essentially are financed outside the state sector, I think that would be my recommendation.
And why doesn't that happen automatically? Why don't investors and institutions control what's going on in terms of executive remuneration and the performance of companies and banks better than they appear to do?
I don't know exactly what the absolute standard of better is. We know that institutions largely or partially from your work, Colin, that institutions do intervene in the governance of firms and do influence CEO compensation, and more importantly, the influence who is the CEO, which seems to be a much bigger concern. So in that sense, I would say there is definitely a level of intervention by outsiders. Whether is at the optimal level, I'm not really sure. And I think again, one reason, at least perhaps this is less true in the UK, but almost everywhere else in the world, is that we have through previous interventions, we've insulated managers and firms from intervention by shareholders with constant attempts to pass anti-takeover laws, laws which make changing corporate charters cumbersome, and then we wonder why CEOs are insulated. Well, perhaps we sort of made the insulation for them.
And thinking about the broader social benefits that might be derived from good corporate governance, do you think that it can contribute not only to shareholder interests but to growth, investment, entrepreneurship in the economy as well?
I would say, of course, that's going to be the case, and I think it's one of the interesting facts that we observe is that these sort of institutions have been documented to be so important to economic growth. Essentially, when you don't have a system of corporate governance, it's effective, and a legal system to back it, you are restricting your economy and your business organizations to be ones where contracts can be informally enforced, which essentially or usually means you're restricting your business organizations to being family-based businesses, which is, since it's obviously not every family has the optimal skills to both manage firms or the amount of capital required, then that's going to lower efficiency a great deal. And so there's a huge amount of evidence that favors that hypothesis.
And do you think that they've got an important role to play in improving the performance of emerging markets and developing economies as well?
Right, I think that's actually a big focus of many emerging economies. I believe that's true. The evidence suggests it's true. And many emerging market economy, many governments in emerging markets seem to believe that. Singapore has invested a great deal in trying to both change its business regulations and expand the even research on corporate governance. And we saw one of the reasons that Korea recovered so quickly from the Asian financial crisis, many believe, is it quickly reformed its bankruptcy law and its corporate system for chartering corporations. So I think yes, the evidence is there.
Professor Noe, thank you very much indeed for the interview. I'm Colin Mayer from Voices from Oxford, the Side Business School at the University of Oxford.